The neighborhood prided itself on appearances. Manicured lawns stretched in uniform rows, trimmed hedges framed identical mailboxes, and the streets curved with deliberate symmetry, as if disorder itself had been zoned out by design. To outsiders, the place looked calm, even idyllic. To those who lived there long enough, however, the calm was enforced, monitored, and guarded by rules that went far beyond paint colors and grass height. At the center of that order stood the Homeowners Association, an entity that described itself as protective but functioned more like a quiet authority. Its presence was felt in warning letters slipped into mailboxes, fines that appeared without explanation, and watchful eyes behind curtains. The board members believed deeply in their role as guardians of the neighborhood's character, a word they used often and defined loosely. Into this environment lived a man named Marcus Hill. Marcus had moved into the neighborhood 3 years earlier. He owned his home outright, a modest but well-kept property at the end of a cul-de-sac. He worked long hours as a systems analyst for a logistics company, often leaving early in the morning and returning after sunset. His routine was predictable. He kept his lawn trimmed, his trash bins properly placed, and his exterior lights functioning. He waved politely to neighbors when passing and otherwise kept to himself. That quiet, however, did not go unnoticed. From the moment Marcus moved in, certain residents watched him more closely than others, not because of anything he did, but because of who he was. He stood out in a neighborhood that had been demographically unchanged for decades. To some, his presence unsettled the unspoken uniformity they had come to expect. Among those residents was Linda Carver. Linda had lived in the neighborhood since its early development and treated that longevity as authority. She served on the HOA board and made her role central to her identity. She believed rules existed for a reason and that enforcing them was a civic duty. Over time, enforcement became something more personal. She watched not just for violations, but for people she believed did not belong. Marcus became one of those people. At first, her attention took the form of observation. She noted his comings and goings, the unfamiliar car in his driveway, the packages delivered to his porch. She watched from her front window, then from behind the blinds, then from the sidewalk when she thought she could pass unnoticed. Each detail fed a narrative she quietly constructed. When no violations presented themselves, irritation set in. The first HOA notice Marcus received was minor. It referenced a complaint about noise. No time was specified, no decibel level noted, no corroboration provided. Marcus read the letter twice, confused. He lived alone, he rarely had guests, he didn't own outdoor speakers. Still, he assumed it was a mistake and let it go. Then came a notice about improper trash placement. Marcus reviewed the HOA handbook and confirmed he had followed it exactly. He took photographs of his bins the following week, just in case. A third notice followed about exterior lighting, claiming one of his porch lights violated aesthetic standards. It did not. None of the notices carried serious penalties, but together they formed a pattern. Marcus began to feel watched. Linda, meanwhile, felt justified. Each complaint, even when unfounded, reinforced her belief that vigilance was necessary. In her mind, order was fragile, and one exception threatened the whole. She spoke often at board meetings about maintaining standards, about preserving property values, about preventing decline. Her words were careful, but her intent was not subtle. Other board members listened, some nodding along out of habit, others out of agreement. None questioned why the same house kept appearing in discussions. Tension in the neighborhood thickened quietly. Neighbors who once waved began to avert their eyes. A few stopped returning Marcus's greetings altogether. Rumors circulated without source or substance. Nothing concrete, nothing actionable, just enough to create distance. The situation escalated one afternoon when Marcus returned home earlier than usual. His workday had ended unexpectedly, and he parked his car in his driveway just as Linda happened to be walking her dog past his house. She paused longer than necessary, her gaze lingering. Marcus nodded politely and continued inside. From her perspective, that nod was not reassurance. It was dismissal. Later that evening, Linda made a call that would change everything. She did not call the HOA board. She did not file another complaint. Instead, she contacted the police non-emergency line and reported suspicious behavior. She described a man she claimed she did not recognize, noted his vehicle, his presence at odd hours, his general demeanor. She framed her concerns as fear, as vigilance, as community responsibility. The police arrived quietly. A patrol car rolled into the cul-de-sac, lights off, presence deliberate. Officers approached Marcus's home and conducted a brief check. They verified his identification, confirmed his address, and left without incident. No report was filed beyond a routine log entry. To the officers, it was another call in a long shift. To Marcus, it was something else entirely. He stood in his living room afterward, the house suddenly feeling smaller, heavier. He had done nothing wrong, yet the presence of law enforcement at his door carried a weight that could not be dismissed. He understood what the call implied. He understood why it had been made. Word traveled fast in the neighborhood. Some residents watched from windows as the patrol car departed. Others whispered later about police activity. Linda, for her part, felt validated. In her mind, the system had worked. Her concerns had been taken seriously. She did not know that the call would not disappear quietly. Marcus did not confront anyone. He did not post on social media. He did not seek immediate legal action. Instead, he began to document. He requested records. He reviewed HOA notices. He made copies. He asked questions through official channels and waited patiently for responses. What he uncovered was not immediately explosive, but it was revealing. The police call, logged and time-stamped, included details that contradicted Linda's version of events. The HOA notices, when compared against official guidelines, showed selective enforcement. Patterns emerged when Marcus widened his scope and requested city records related to the neighborhood itself. Those records, archived and largely forgotten, told a story far older than the HOA. A story about land use, zoning decisions, and agreements made long before Linda ever moved in. A story about boundaries drawn and redrawn, about exclusions formalized through policy rather than words. Marcus realized then that this was no longer about a single call or a single homeowner. It was about power, perception, and a system that had never expected to be examined this closely. As he organized the documents on his dining table, the weight in the house shifted. What had begun as quiet discomfort was turning into resolve. He understood that the truth, once public, would not only protect him, it would expose far more than the HOA ever intended. The neighborhood remained calm on the surface, unaware that its foundation was about to be tested. And as Marcus prepared his next steps, the stage was set for a reckoning that would reach far beyond a single street, carrying consequences no one on the board had imagined. The silence before that reckoning was thick, and it would not last much longer. Marcus moved deliberately after that night, not out of fear, but out of clarity. The police visit had stripped away any remaining doubt about what he was facing. This was no longer a series of misunderstandings or overzealous rule enforcement. It was something systemic, something that thrived on silence and the assumption that no one would push back. He began with the city. At first, the process felt tedious. Public records requests were filed through online portals and followed up with emails that promised delayed responses due to staffing or processing times. Marcus waited patiently, knowing that impatience often led people to give up. He did not. He treated the effort like a long-term project, setting reminders, keeping logs, and cataloging every response he received. What arrived first were the police records. The log from the non-emergency call was brief but telling. It noted that the caller reported suspicious presence without specifying a crime or behavior. It recorded that officers found the homeowner verified and compliant with no further action taken. There was no warning, no citation, no follow-up. On paper, the incident was nothing, but Marcus understood the implication behind the words. He placed that record in a folder labeled Timeline and moved on. Next came HOA documentation. He requested copies of violation notices issued across the neighborhood over the past 5 years. At first, the HOA resisted, citing privacy concerns. Marcus responded with statutes outlining homeowners' rights to anonymized enforcement data. The resistance softened. When the data finally arrived, it was incomplete. Entire months were missing. Certain properties appeared repeatedly, while others never appeared at all. Marcus referenced the addresses with public ownership records, demographic data, and move-in dates. Patterns formed quickly. A small cluster of homes accounted for the majority of citations. Most of those homeowners had moved in within the last decade. Several shared visible traits that set them apart from the long-standing residents. Meanwhile, some of the most obvious violations in the neighborhood, overgrown hedges, unapproved modifications, chronic noise complaints, were absent from the records entirely. Selective enforcement was no longer a suspicion. It was documented. As Marcus worked, the atmosphere in the neighborhood shifted subtly. Linda continued her routines, walking her dog past his house, attending HOA meetings, speaking confidently about maintaining standards. But there was an edge to her vigilance now. She noticed Marcus spending more time at home during the day, occasionally photographing common areas or reviewing documents on his porch. She interpreted this as defiance. To Linda, rules were meant to be followed quietly, questions were disruptive, documentation was threatening. The idea that someone she viewed as an outsider might challenge the HOA authority unsettled her deeply. She raised concerns with other board members, framing Marcus's behavior as hostile. She described him as uncooperative, unneighborly, potentially litigious. The language was careful, but carried intent. Some board members grew uncomfortable. Others, long accustomed to Linda's leadership, deferred without question. No one contacted Marcus directly. The next batch of city records arrived in a thick digital file. These documents predated the HOA entirely. They included zoning maps, development agreements, and correspondence between city planners and the original developers. Marcus studied them line by line, highlighting sections, making notes in the margins. One document stood out. It detailed a land use agreement from decades earlier, one that placed specific conditions on the neighborhood's development. These conditions included requirements for inclusive access, limitations on private governance authority, and restrictions on enforcement practices that could conflict with municipal oversight. Marcus realized that the HOA authority was not as absolute as it claimed. More importantly, he found evidence that those conditions had been quietly ignored. Over the years, amendments had been proposed and withdrawn. Enforcement guidelines had been rewritten internally without city approval. Fines had been assessed in ways that exceeded the HOA original mandate. The board operated as though its power were total, unchecked by the agreements that allowed it to exist in the first place. Marcus began assembling his findings into a comprehensive record. He was careful, methodical. Each claim was backed by documentation. Each pattern was illustrated with data. He avoided speculation, focusing instead on what could be proven. Meanwhile, the HOA escalated. Another notice appeared in Marcus's mailbox, this one citing community behavior concerns. The language was vague, the accusations broad. It referenced complaints without sources, discomfort without specifics. Marcus recognized it for what it was, an attempt to assert control through intimidation. He added the notice to his folder. Neighbors began to notice the tension more openly now. Some whispered about legal trouble. Others speculated about Marcus's intentions. A few, emboldened by the shifting dynamics, quietly expressed support. They had their own stories, their own frustrations with arbitrary enforcement and unexplained fines. Marcus listened, but did not involve them yet. He understood the power of timing. Linda, sensing resistance, contacted the city herself. She framed her call as a request for clarification, but her tone suggested concern about a homeowner who was causing trouble. The response she received was polite but non-committal. The city official reminded her that HOA were subject to oversight and encouraged transparency. That response unsettled her. For the first time, Linda felt the ground beneath her authority shift. She doubled down, scheduling a special HOA meeting to discuss community safety and legal preparedness. Notices went out. Attendance was encouraged. Marcus received his notice and smiled grimly. He continued his work. By the end of the month, he had assembled a timeline that stretched back nearly half a century. It showed how the neighborhood had been shaped, how power had consolidated, and how enforcement had evolved into something exclusionary. It showed how complaints like Linda's were not anomalies but expressions of a broader pattern. He prepared a formal request to the city for a compliance review. This request included his findings, his documentation, and a clear explanation of why the HOA practices warranted scrutiny. He submitted it through official channels and waited. The city responded faster than expected. They acknowledged receipt. They confirmed that a review would be initiated. They requested additional documentation, which Marcus provided promptly. The process was underway. Linda did not know any of this yet. She continued to believe that authority resided solely within the HOA, that the board's word was final. She did not realize that the very records she had never bothered to read were now being examined by people with far greater power. As the city began its review, inspectors quietly accessed archives, compared enforcement logs, and reviewed past complaints. They noticed the same patterns Marcus had documented. They asked questions the HOA struggled to answer. The neighborhood remained outwardly calm, but tension simmered beneath the surface. Conversations grew cautious. Board members exchanged nervous emails. Linda felt a creeping sense of unease she could not fully articulate. Marcus, meanwhile, waited. He knew that exposure rarely arrived with drama at first. It arrived with paperwork, with audits, with questions that demanded answers. He understood that the truth, once set in motion, moved steadily, inexorably. The next phase would not be quiet, and when the city's findings began to surface, the power dynamics of the neighborhood would shift in ways no one on the HOA board was prepared to handle. The reckoning was no longer a possibility. It was approaching. The records did not reveal themselves all at once. They came in fragments, scanned pages with faded ink, zoning maps layered with revisions, meeting minutes written in bureaucratic language that concealed more than it explained. Marcus spent evenings reading them slowly, line by line, cross-referencing dates and signatures. What initially looked like routine municipal paperwork began to form a larger picture, one that unsettled him the more he understood it. The neighborhood had not always been what it claimed to be. Decades earlier, before the HOA existed, the land had been part of a larger development proposal that included mixed-income housing and shared public access roads. City planning documents showed early resistance from nearby residents, followed by closed-door meetings and revised zoning requests. Over time, the plans shifted. Affordable housing was removed. Public access easements were quietly restricted. What emerged was a private community with boundaries designed not just for aesthetics, but for exclusion. The HOA, formed later, inherited those boundaries without question. Marcus noticed something else as he dug deeper. Several HOA rules referenced city ordinances that no longer existed or had been amended years ago. Fines were issued under outdated codes. Enforcement authority was cited beyond what the HOA legally possessed. In some cases, the association had been operating on assumptions rather than law. None of that was accidental. Linda Carver's name appeared repeatedly in meeting minutes spanning more than a decade. She was not just a board member, she was a constant. Her influence shaped policies, guided enforcement priorities, and framed community standards in ways that favored some residents while scrutinizing others. Her language in the minutes was careful, always couched in terms of safety and preservation, but the outcomes were consistent. Selective enforcement was not a side effect, it was the mechanism. Marcus expanded his records request to include police call logs from the neighborhood over the past 5 years. The data confirmed what he had suspected. Calls, labeled as suspicious person or unknown activity, disproportionately targeted residents who did not fit the neighborhood's historical profile. Most resulted in no action. Most were initiated by the same small group of callers. Linda's name appeared again. The realization settled heavily. What had felt personal was, in fact, systemic. The call to the police had not been an isolated reaction. It was part of a pattern that relied on authority figures to enforce unspoken boundaries. The HOA did not need to say who belonged and who did not. The rules selectively applied did that work for them. Marcus remained outwardly unchanged. He continued his routine. He went to work, maintained his property, and avoided confrontation. Internally, however, his focus sharpened. He began organizing the records into categories: zoning history, HOA authority limits, enforcement discrepancies, police involvement. Each category told part of the story. Together, they formed something difficult to ignore. The first ripple reached the HOA when Marcus submitted a formal request for clarification. He asked, in writing, for the legal basis of specific fines issued against his property. He requested documentation supporting the HOA authority to involve law enforcement in non-emergency situations. He cited city ordinances by number and date, attaching copies of the current statutes. The board was unprepared for the level of detail. Responses came slowly, delayed by administrative review. When they did arrive, they were vague, evasive, and occasionally contradictory. References were made to policies that could not be produced. Authority was asserted without citation. The more the board tried to deflect, the clearer their uncertainty became. Linda felt the shift immediately. At the next HOA meeting, she framed Marcus's requests as disruptive. She warned that excessive challenges could undermine the association's ability to function. She suggested that legal posturing threatened community harmony. Her words were firm, but beneath them was something new: defensiveness. Other board members, less entrenched, began to ask questions. They requested copies of the documents Marcus referenced. They noticed discrepancies they had previously overlooked. For the first time in years, Linda's certainty was not universally accepted. Outside the boardroom, neighbors noticed changes as well. The familiar warning letters slowed. Fines stopped appearing in mailboxes without explanation. The atmosphere shifted from confident enforcement to cautious observation. People who had once repeated Linda's concerns began to distance themselves from her rhetoric. The idea that the HOA might be operating beyond its authority was unsettling. Marcus, meanwhile, took his findings one step further. He submitted a public records request to the city clerk's office for archived correspondence between the HOA and city officials. What returned weeks later was more revealing than he anticipated. Emails and letters showed the HOA had been repeatedly advised to limit its enforcement scope. Warnings about overreach had been issued and ignored. In one instance, a city attorney explicitly cautioned against involving police for non-criminal matters, citing potential liability. Those warnings had been dismissed. Marcus did not share the documents immediately. He understood the importance of timing. Instead, he consulted with a civil rights advocacy group, presenting the records without sensationalism. The response was measured but serious. They recognized the implications. What Marcus had uncovered went beyond HOA mismanagement. It pointed to coordinated actions that could expose the association and individual board members to legal consequences. The police department, notified through proper channels, began its own internal review. The calls from the neighborhood, once routine, were now examined for bias and misuse. Officers involved were interviewed. Logs were cross-checked. The call that had brought them to Marcus's door resurfaced in that review, now seen in context rather than isolation. Linda sensed the walls closing in, though she did not yet understand how. She doubled down publicly, emphasizing safety concerns and accusing unnamed individuals of threatening the neighborhood's stability. Privately, she contacted legal counsel seeking reassurance. The answers she received were not what she hoped. The counsel advised caution, transparency, and cooperation, words Linda was not accustomed to hearing directed at her. The HOA board scheduled a special meeting to address ongoing concerns. Attendance was higher than usual. Residents wanted answers. They wanted to know why fines had been issued inconsistently, why police had been involved, and whether the association's actions exposed them to risk. Marcus attended quietly, sitting near the back. When documents were presented, they spoke louder than any speech. Dates, signatures, and official warnings left little room for interpretation. The narrative Linda had controlled for years began to unravel under the weight of verified records. No accusations were made aloud that evening. None were necessary. The realization spread through the room that the HOA authority had been assumed, not upheld, that its enforcement had relied on fear, not law, and that the consequences of those assumptions were now unavoidable. As the meeting adjourned, the neighborhood felt different. The order that had once seemed immovable was suddenly fragile. Residents left with unease rather than certainty, aware that the rules they had trusted were under scrutiny. Marcus returned home that night knowing the hardest part was still ahead. The records were no longer just his. They were public, official, and impossible to dismiss. What remained was the fallout, legal, personal, and communal, that would follow once the full story reached beyond the neighborhood. And as city investigators prepared to release their findings, the HOA board faced a reality it had never planned for: accountability. The release of the city records marked a turning point, not just for Marcus, but for the entire neighborhood. What had once been a quiet suburb governed by routine notices and closed-door HOA meetings was now under public scrutiny. The documents did not shout or accuse. They simply existed, undeniable and meticulously verified, and that existence alone was enough to fracture the illusion of order the HOA had carefully maintained for years. Within days, the neighborhood's name began circulating beyond its borders. Local journalists picked up the story after a community activist shared the records online. The coverage focused not on sensational language but on patterns: long-term selective enforcement, repeated complaints against specific homeowners, a consistent overlap between HOA actions and police involvement that disproportionately targeted residents who did not fit the neighborhood's historical demographic profile. Marcus watched the attention unfold from a distance. He did not give interviews. He did not comment publicly. He allowed the records to speak, understanding that restraint gave them more power than outrage ever could. Each article, each post, each quiet analysis added another layer of pressure to a system unaccustomed to being questioned. Inside the HOA board, panic replaced confidence. Emergency meetings were called under the guise of clarification sessions. Board members gathered in tense silence, shuffling papers they had once approved without thought. Linda Carver, who had once dominated these meetings with certainty, now found herself defensive, her voice less steady. She insisted that everything had been done according to protocol, that complaints were anonymous, that enforcement was neutral. But the documents contradicted her assertions in ways that could not be explained away. Emails surfaced showing internal discussions about maintaining neighborhood standards, language that took on new meaning when paired with enforcement data. Meeting minutes revealed repeated references to Marcus's address, often without specific violations attached. Even more damaging were archived zoning communications from years earlier, showing how the HOA had been granted authority in exchange for compliance with city diversity requirements the board had quietly undermined through policy enforcement rather than explicit refusal. The city took notice. Officials from the housing department requested formal explanations. The police department initiated an internal review of non-emergency calls originating from the neighborhood, flagging repeated reports from the same source. Linda's name appeared frequently, attached to calls labeled suspicious activity, that had resulted in no findings. The narrative shifted from one homeowner being questioned to an entire system being examined. Residents who had once trusted the HOA without question began to ask their own. Some felt betrayed, realizing that rules they believed applied equally had been used selectively. Others felt fear, worried about potential legal consequences tied to decisions they had passively supported. The unity the HOA claimed to protect fractured under the weight of accountability. Marcus continued his routine as the storm gathered. He went to work, returned home, and maintained his property as he always had. But the atmosphere around him had changed. Neighbors who once avoided eye contact now watched him with a mixture of curiosity and discomfort. A few offered tentative smiles. Others crossed the street when passing his house, unsure how to reconcile their assumptions with the reality unfolding around them. Behind the scenes, the legal machinery began to move. The city issued a formal notice to the HOA, requesting a comprehensive audit of enforcement practices over the past 10 years. Failure to comply would result in suspension of the association's authority. The board hired legal counsel, scrambling to prepare defenses that grew weaker with every uncovered document. Linda felt the pressure most acutely. Her confidence had always come from believing she represented the majority, that her actions were justified by tradition and shared values. Now, those beliefs isolated her. Board members distanced themselves, careful in their language, careful in their emails. Conversations that once happened casually now occurred through attorneys. She revisited the day she had called the police, replaying it repeatedly in her mind. What had felt like vigilance now appeared reckless. The language she used, the assumptions she made, the certainty she carried, none of it aged well under review. The police department's findings were released quietly, but carried significant weight. The call against Marcus was deemed unfounded, rooted in bias rather than observable behavior. While no criminal charges were filed, the report explicitly criticized the misuse of emergency resources and highlighted the role of implicit profiling. That report became another piece of the growing public record. Community meetings grew tense. Attendance surged as residents demanded answers. Longtime homeowners spoke for the first time, questioning why certain families had been fined repeatedly while others were overlooked. Younger residents, once disengaged from HOA politics, began organizing, calling for transparency and reform. The board's authority weakened visibly. Marcus, still silent publicly, submitted one final request to the city. He asked for confirmation of the original land use agreements tied to the neighborhood's development. The response arrived weeks later, comprehensive and damning. The HOA authority was conditional, contingent on fair and non-discriminatory enforcement. Violations of that condition allowed the city to intervene directly. The city council scheduled a hearing. As the date approached, anxiety settled over the neighborhood like a low fog. Yard signs appeared supporting reform. Others called for dissolving the HOA entirely. The sense of control that once defined the community dissolved into uncertainty. Linda stopped attending public gatherings. Her role, once a source of pride, had become a liability. She communicated only through legal representation, issuing statements that avoided responsibility while attempting to preserve credibility. But credibility, once lost, proved impossible to reclaim. Marcus prepared quietly for the hearing, organizing his documents one last time. He did not seek revenge in the way the neighborhood expected. He sought correction. His goal was not punishment, but exposure. He understood that systems only changed when confronted with their own records. The night before the hearing, the neighborhood was unusually still. Porch lights glowed against the darkness, illuminating streets that had never felt so uncertain. The calm, once enforced, now felt fragile. What would emerge from the hearing would redefine the community's future. And for the first time since he moved in, Marcus felt that the quiet he carried was no longer a vulnerability, but a strength, one that had carried him to the edge of a reckoning that could no longer be avoided. The outcome was close. and the consequences would be permanent. By the time the city released its formal findings, the neighborhood no longer felt like the controlled, polished community it once pretended to be. The illusion of order had fractured, replaced by quiet panic and carefully rehearsed denials. What had begun as a single police call had now grown into a full institutional reckoning, and everyone involved could feel the pressure tightening. The official report did not rely on emotion or opinion. It relied on records. It detailed how HOA enforcement actions over the past 15 years disproportionately targeted a small subset of homeowners, most of whom shared similar backgrounds. It outlined how warnings escalated to fines, how fines escalated to liens, and how those liens often resulted in forced property sales. It compared violation types across the neighborhood and demonstrated how identical issues went unaddressed on some properties while being aggressively punished on others. The language was clinical, but the implications were devastating. For Marcus, reading the report was both validating and sobering. It confirmed what he had suspected from the beginning, but it also revealed how deeply embedded the problem was. This was not the work of one overly vigilant HOA member or a handful of bad decisions. It was a system that had functioned unchecked for years, relying on silence and compliance to survive. The city forwarded its findings to multiple departments. Civil rights investigators were notified. The municipal legal office began reviewing past foreclosure cases tied to the HOA. The police department opened an internal review to assess whether similar calls had been made under comparable circumstances and whether bias had influenced responses. Each step widened the circle. The HOA board, now operating under scrutiny, scrambled to protect itself. Emergency meetings were held behind closed doors. Lawyers were retained. Statements were drafted and redrafted, each version attempting to sound cooperative while deflecting responsibility. Board members began distancing themselves from one another, quietly suggesting that enforcement decisions had been driven by individual actors rather than collective agreement. Linda Carver, once the most vocal presence on the board, found herself increasingly isolated. Her name appeared repeatedly throughout the report. Her complaints were logged more frequently than any other board members. Her language, while never explicitly discriminatory, revealed patterns of suspicion and escalation that were impossible to ignore. In internal HOA emails recovered during the investigation, she was often the first to flag certain properties and the most persistent in demanding action. Neighbors who once praised her diligence now avoided eye contact. Outside the boardroom, the community itself began to fracture. Residents who had never paid much attention to HOA governance were suddenly forced to confront its consequences. Some learned, for the first time, how close they had come to similar treatment. Others recognized familiar tactics they had dismissed as normal. A few, confronted with the data, experienced an uncomfortable realization about their own silence. Marcus remained largely out of sight during this period. He did not give interviews. He did not attend neighborhood gatherings. He let the records speak for themselves. When reporters requested comment, his responses were brief and measured, focused on accountability rather than accusation. That restraint only amplified the impact. As the story spread beyond the neighborhood, public interest grew. Advocacy groups requested copies of the city's findings. Legal analysts dissected the report, highlighting its implications for HOA governance nationwide. What had once been a localized dispute was now being discussed as a case study in structural bias and unchecked authority. the City Council scheduled a public session to address the findings. Attendance exceeded expectations. Residents filled the chamber, some anxious, some angry, others simply curious. The council members spoke cautiously, aware that their words would be scrutinized just as closely as the HOA actions had been. They acknowledged failures in oversight, they pledged reforms, they promised transparency. Behind the scenes, consequences were already unfolding. The city suspended the HOA authority to issue fines pending further review. An independent administrator was appointed to oversee community operations temporarily. All outstanding liens were frozen. Homeowners who had lost properties under questionable circumstances were notified that their cases were being re-evaluated. For some families, that notification arrived too late to undo years of loss. For others, it reopened doors they thought had been permanently closed. Linda received her own notice shortly after the council session. It informed her that she was under formal investigation for abuse of authority and that her role on the HOA board was suspended effective immediately. The language was impersonal, but the message was unmistakable. Power she had wielded so confidently was gone. She retreated from public view, her carefully maintained image unraveling under the weight of documentation she could not dispute. The neighborhood changed in subtle but undeniable ways. Conversations shifted. Assumptions were questioned. The same streets that once felt rigidly controlled now felt uncertain, as if residents were seeing them for the first time without the filter of enforced conformity. Marcus felt that change most acutely during his evening walks. Neighbors who had avoided him now nodded again, some offering tentative smiles. A few stopped to express quiet support, though often couched in awkward language. He accepted it without bitterness, understanding that change, when it comes, rarely arrives cleanly. Still, the process was far from over. Civil litigation loomed. The city's findings provided a foundation, but accountability would require more than reports and suspensions. It would require legal consequences, policy changes, and acknowledgement of harm done. Marcus knew that the next phase would be the most challenging. Systems rarely corrected themselves willingly. Resistance, subtle or overt, was inevitable. But he also knew that the truth, once exposed, had momentum of its own. As autumn approached, the neighborhood stood at a crossroads. It could retreat into defensiveness and denial, or it could confront what the records had revealed and rebuild something more honest in its place. The choice, for once, was not being made behind closed doors. And as preparations began for the next public hearing, one that would determine the HOA future and the fate of those who had led it, the quiet street that had once been defined by enforced silence braced itself for the final reckoning still to come. The release of the city records did not create chaos at first. It created silence. For days after the documents went public, the neighborhood existed in an uneasy pause. Lawns were still mowed. Cars still came and went. But conversations stopped mid-sentence, and eye contact became rare. People who had once repeated HOA talking points now avoided any mention of the board at all. The sense of order that had defined the community for years was suddenly hollow, as if everyone realized at once that it had been built on something fragile and deeply flawed. The city moved faster than the HOA ever had. Within a week, formal notices were issued. Investigations were announced. Letters arrived at board members' homes bearing official seals instead of HOA logos. The same mechanisms the board had once used to intimidate residents were now turned inward, precise and unyielding. Linda Carver received her notice on a quiet morning. It detailed allegations of discriminatory enforcement, misuse of authority, and improper coordination with law enforcement. It referenced dates, document numbers, and archived correspondence she had never imagined would resurface. The tone was clinical, devoid of emotion, and far more unsettling than anger ever could be. Her long-held sense of control evaporated in a matter of paragraphs. Other board members were not spared. Even those who had remained passive found themselves implicated by inaction. Emails were subpoenaed, meeting minutes were scrutinized, voting records were reviewed for patterns that now seemed impossible to ignore. The board's insistence that they had simply followed the rules collapsed under the weight of evidence showing those rules had been applied selectively, strategically, and with clear bias. The police department conducted its own internal review. The call made about Marcus Hill, once considered routine, was reclassified under a broader examination of racially motivated reporting. Officers involved were cleared of wrongdoing, but the pattern of calls originating from the same individuals across multiple years painted a troubling picture. City officials addressed the issue publicly, acknowledging systemic failures without naming individuals at first. That restraint did not last. Once the records were already circulating, names followed naturally. The HOA attempted damage control. Emergency meetings were called. Statements were drafted and revised repeatedly. An apology letter was proposed, then watered down, then abandoned entirely when legal counsel advised against admissions of fault. The association's attorney resigned citing conflict of interest, followed shortly by the property management firm that had overseen enforcement for years. The unraveling was swift. Linda, once a fixture of authority, withdrew from public view. Her house remained closed, blinds drawn at all hours. When she did appear, it was only to collect mail or speak briefly with legal counsel. The confidence that had once driven her actions was replaced by something brittle and defensive. She no longer spoke of protecting the neighborhood's character. She spoke only of misunderstandings and intentions. Those explanations found little sympathy. Residents who had once accepted HOA notices without question began revisiting their own histories. Fines paid without appeal, modifications denied without explanation, harassment that had felt personal but had been dismissed as coincidence. As stories surfaced, it became clear that Marcus's experience had not been unique, only the most thoroughly documented. Class action discussions began quietly, then gained momentum. The city imposed immediate changes. The HOA enforcement powers were suspended pending review. An independent administrator was appointed to oversee operations. Mandatory bias training was ordered, not as a gesture, but as a condition for the association's continued existence. New election procedures were established, with oversight from municipal authorities. For the first time in decades, the board could not simply police itself. Marcus watched these developments from a distance. He did not attend press conferences or speak publicly beyond submitting formal statements when requested. He continued his routine, still leaving early, still returning late, still maintaining his home with the same quiet consistency as before. The difference was in how the neighborhood responded. Greetings returned, tentative at first, then sincere. Some neighbors offered apologies without knowing exactly how to phrase them. Others simply nodded, a recognition that something had shifted and could not be undone. A few avoided him entirely, unable or unwilling to confront their own role in what had happened. Marcus did not seek validation. He had never wanted attention. What he wanted was peace, and the assurance that peace would not depend on someone else's permission. The investigation concluded months later with clear findings. The HOA was found liable for discriminatory practices. Financial penalties were imposed. Several former board members were barred from serving in similar roles again. Policies that had been used to mask bias were dismantled and rewritten under city supervision. Linda's name appeared in the final report, not as a villain, but as a case study in unchecked authority. Her actions were described plainly, stripped of justification, preserved permanently in public record. The irony was unavoidable. The same archives she had never considered important enough to consult had ultimately undone everything she believed she controlled. As for Marcus, the city offered restitution and formal acknowledgement of wrongdoing. He accepted what was necessary and declined what felt performative. He did not need plaques or proclamations. The documents spoke loudly enough. Life in the neighborhood settled into something new, less rigid, less performative, still imperfect but aware. Rules existed, but they were enforced transparently. Questions were answered instead of deflected. Authority was no longer assumed, it was accountable. On a quiet evening, Marcus sat on his porch, watching the sun set over the cul-de-sac. The houses looked the same as they always had, but the weight they carried felt lighter. The street no longer seemed like a place where silence was demanded, but one where it could simply exist. The story did not end with applause or confrontation. It ended with records, accountability, and the slow rebuilding of trust. And in that quiet resolution, the neighborhood finally became what it had always claimed to be, a community governed not by fear or suspicion, but by fairness written clearly for everyone to see.
If you liked this story, please like, subscribe, and share it with others so they can learn something from it too.